Chapter 5, Part 2 of Explorers and Travelers by Adolphus W. Greely. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Tomko. Chapter 5, Captain Meriwether Lewis and Lieutenant William Clark, Part 2. On the 20th, 2,270 miles from St. Louis, they came to the greenish-yellow waters of the Musselshell, and a short distance beyond Captain Lewis caught his first glimpse of the Rocky Mountains, the object of his hope and ambition. Beyond the Musselshell their experiences were less pleasant. The country became more barren, game and timber scarce, mosquitoes annoying, the high dry winds full of sand made their eyes sore. The sun of midday burned, while most every night ice or frost chilled them. The clear waters of the Judith River and its woods, beautiful with multitudinous mountain roses, the fragrant honeysuckle, and the tiny red willows, delighted their eyes, but the sight of 126 lately abandoned lodge fires caused some uneasiness, as indicating a late camping place of a war party of vicious northern Minnetarees, or Blackfeet. A few miles farther, as they passed a precipice 120 feet high, they saw evidence of the cunning and wasteful methods of hunting by Indians, for the remains of over 100 buffalo were scattered around, though the stream must have washed many away. Lewis adds, "These buffaloes had been chased down the precipice in a way very common on the Missouri, and by which vast herds were destroyed in a moment. The mode of hunting is to select one of the most active and fleet young men, who is disguised in a buffalo skin round his body. The skin of the head, with the ears and horns, are fastened on his own head in such a way as to deceive the buffalo. Thus dressed, he fixes himself at a convenient distance between a herd of buffalo and any of the river precipices, which sometimes extend for several miles. His companions, in the meantime, get in the rear and side of the herd, and at a given signal show themselves and advance toward the buffalo. They instantly take the alarm, and finding the hunters beside them, they run toward the disguised Indian or decoy, who leads them on at full speed toward the river, when suddenly securing himself in some crevice of the cliff, which he had previously fixed on, the herd is left on the brink of the precipice. It is then in vain for the foremost to retreat or even to stop. They are pressed on by the hindmost ranks, who, seeing no danger but from the hunters, goad on those before them till the whole are precipitated and the shore is strewed with their dead bodies. Sometimes in this perilous seduction the Indian himself is either trodden under foot or, missing his footing in the cliff, is urged down the precipice by the falling herd." The river now took the form of frequent rapids, which made the work of dragging the heavy canoes very painful, and the narrative runs, "The banks are so slippery in some places, and the mud so adhesive, that the men are unable to wear moccasins. 1/4 of the time they are obliged to be up to their armpits in the cold water, and sometimes walk for yards over sharp fragments of rocks." On June 3d they came to where the river divided into two large streams, and it became of vital importance to the expedition to determine which was the Missouri, or Amateyaza, as the Minnetarees called it, and which, they said, approached very near to the Columbia. The success of the expedition depended on the right decision, so Captain Lewis concluded to encamp until reconnoitering columns could examine the two forks. Lewis, following up the north branch, 2 days' march, decided that it was not the Missouri, and named it Maria's River. In returning, he narrowly escaped slipping over a precipice some 90 feet high. Lewis had just reached a spot of safety when, says the narrative, he heard a voice behind him cry out, "Good God, Captain, what shall I do?" He turned instantly, and found it was Windsor, who had lost his foothold about the middle of the narrow pass, and had slipped down to the very verge of the precipice, where he lay on his belly, with his right arm and leg over the precipice, while with the other leg and arm he was with difficulty holding on to keep himself from being dashed to pieces below. His dreadful situation was instantly perceived by Captain Lewis, who, stifling his alarm, calmly told him that he was in no danger, that he should take his knife out of his belt with the right hand and dig a hole in the side of the bluff to receive his foot. With great presence of mind he did this, and then raised himself on his knees. Captain Lewis then told him to take off his moccasins and come forward on his hands and knees, holding a knife in one hand and his rifle in the other. He immediately crawled in this way till he came to a secure spot. One of Lieutenant Clark's party on the South Fork at the same time ran great danger from a grizzly bear which attacked near camp a man whose gun, being wet, would not go off. The man took to a tree, so closely followed by the animal that he struck the hunter's foot as he was climbing. The bear showed his intention of waiting until the man should be forced to descend, but fortunately, alarmed by the cries and signal shots of a searching party, decamped. While Lewis and Clark concurred in believing the South Fork to be the true Missouri, the rest of the party were unanimous in thinking the north the right course. Finally, caching their heaviest boat and all the supplies which could well be spared, the entire party followed the South Fork. Lewis, pushing on confidently with 4 men, confirmed his opinion by reaching, on June 13th, the great falls of the Missouri, which by their sublime majesty and stupendous magnitude fascinated him. The description of these falls at the time of their first view by civilized man is worthy of reproduction. The river, 300 yards wide, was shut in by precipitous cliffs, and for 90 yards from the left cliff the water falls in one smooth sheet over a precipice of 80 feet. The rest of the river precipitates itself with a more rapid current, but received as it falls by the irregular and projecting rocks below, forms a splendid prospect of white foam 200 yards in length. This spray is dissipated in 1,000 shapes. As it rises from the fall, it beats with fury against a ledge of rocks which extend across the river. On examination, Lewis found that the river for 3 miles below was one continued succession of rapids and cascades, overhung with perpendicular bluffs from 150 to 200 feet high. In short, it seemed to have worn itself a channel through the solid rock. At the main falls, 5 miles above the first, the whole Missouri is suddenly stopped by one shelving rock, which, without a single niche and with an edge as straight and regular as if formed by art, stretches itself from one side of the river to the other for at least 1/4 of a mile. Over this the river precipitates itself in an even, uninterrupted sheet to the perpendicular depth of 50 feet, whence, dashing against the rocky bottom, it rushes rapidly down, leaving behind it a spray of the purest foam across the river. The scene was singularly beautiful, without any of the wild, irregular sublimity of the lower falls. In a cottonwood tree, on a small island in the middle of the rapids, an eagle had fixed its nest, a solitary bird which had not escaped the observation of the Indians, who had previously described it to Lewis. On leaving the falls, Lewis saw a herd of 1,000 buffalo, and killed one for supper. In his eagerness he failed to reload his rifle, when he beheld a grizzly bear stealing on him and not over 20 paces distant. He felt that there was no safety but in flight. It was in the open, level plain, so that there was no possible mode of concealment. As soon as he turned, the bear ran, open-mouthed and at full speed, upon him. Captain Lewis ran about 80 yards, but finding that the animal gained on him fast, he turned short, plunged into the river about waist deep, and, facing about, presented the point of his spontoon. The bear arrived at the water's edge within 20 feet of him, but as soon as he put himself in this posture of defense, the animal seemed frightened and retreated with as much precipitation as he had pursued. The means and route for portage presented difficult problems for the exhausted party, as it was clearly evident that the men could not carry the boats on their shoulders such great distances. Fortunately, a creek was found at the foot of the falls, where the banks afforded easy access to the highlands. It was first necessary to cross the Missouri, and here the party went into camp while preparations were made for the portage. Lieutenant Clark, with a few men, carefully surveyed the trail to be followed. Others engaged in hunting in order to lay up a store of dried meat, and the handy men of the party set to work on a carriage for the transport of the boats. By good fortune, they found a large cottonwood tree, about 22 inches in diameter, large enough to make the carriage wheels, perhaps the only tree of that size within 20 miles. As they had decided to cache a part of their stores and leave their largest boat behind, its mast supplied them with 2 axle trees. In the meantime, the survey of Clark showed that the series of cataracts had an aggregate descent of 363 feet in 17 miles, and that a very difficult portage of 13 miles was necessary. The country was barely practicable for travel, and was covered with frequent patches of prickly pear, against the tiny penetrating needles of which the moccasins of the dragging men afforded almost no protection. To add to their misfortunes, when about 5 miles from their destination, the axle trees, made of the old mast, broke, and then the tongues of green cottonwood gave way. After diligent search, sweet willow trees were found with which they managed, by shifts and expedients familiar to frontiersmen, to patch up the carriage so as to go on. It broke down so completely about a half mile from the new camp that it was easier to carry boat and baggage on their shoulders than to build a new conveyance. The condition of the party is evident from the narrative. The men are loaded as heavily as their strength will permit. The crossing is really painful. Some are limping with the soreness of their feet. Others are scarcely able to stand for more than a few minutes from the heat and fatigue. They are all obliged to halt and rest frequently, and at almost every stopping place they fall, and many of them are asleep in an instant. Later it was needful to repair the carriage and to travel over and over the portage until, after 10 days of weary labor, all the equipage was above the falls. In the meantime, the hunters had accumulated nearly half a ton of dried meat, buffalo being plenty. The grizzly bear, however, was also present, active, aggressive, and dangerous as usual. They infested the camp at night, causing much alarm, and once carried off buffalo meat from a pole within 30 yards of the men. A hunter set out to bring in meat was boldly attacked by a bear and narrowly escaped death, being pursued to within 40 paces of the camp. Another animal was killed when rushing up to attack men who had to climb a tree, while making sufficient noise to attract their rescuer, Dreyer, the interpreter and hunter, who shot him through the head. He proved to be the largest they had seen, being 8 feet 7 1/2 inches long, while his fore feet measured 9 inches and hind feet 7 inches across, and 11 3/4 long exclusive of the talons. Another hunter was attacked by a grizzly, fortunately near the river, so that he was able to conceal himself under a steep bank; otherwise he would probably have lost his life. The perils of navigation and the chase were not all, for a cloudburst and hailstorm contributed to their danger and suffering. The hail was so large and driven so furiously by the high wind that it knocked down several of the men, one 3 times, bruising another very badly, and wounding some so that they bled freely. The fallen hail lay in drifts, which in places completely covered the ground, and some of the stones weighed 3 ounces and measured 7 inches in circumference. Clark, Chaboneau, and his wife took shelter under shelving rocks in a deep ravine, congratulating themselves on their protected position. Suddenly, however, the rain fell in a solid mass, and instantly collecting in the ravine, came rolling down in a dreadful torrent, carrying rocks and everything before it. But for Lieutenant Clark, Chaboneau, his wife and child would have been lost. So instantly was the rise of the water that as Lieutenant Clark had reached his gun and began to ascend the bank, the water was up to his waist, and he could scarce get up faster than it rose, till it reached the height of 15 feet, with a furious current which, had they waited a moment longer, would have swept them into the river just above the Great Falls, down which they must have inevitably been precipitated. Though the phases of their daily life brought much that was rough and hard, yet their privations were not unmixed with pleasures, rude though they may seem to the city dweller. Long tramps and exciting rides after game, side marches to commanding hilltops for grateful views of an unknown country, barren to the eye perhaps, but grateful to the soul, for were they not the first men of their race who ever looked upon it? Or pleasant journeys through upland forests or the undergrowth of the intervale to search and gather whatever was beautiful to the eye, novel to the mind, or a welcome addition to their scanty larder, which were their rare pleasures. Now they waded through waist-high patches of wild rye, recalling with its fine soft beard the waving fields of grain they had left in the far east. Again they pushed on in these dense copses of the sinuous redwood, whose delicate inner bark furnished pleasant Indian tobacco to the Frenchman and half breed. Sometimes the trail lay through an open wood with smaller undergrowth, where beds of odorous mint recalled his Virginian home to Lewis, where the delicate mountain rose, in countless thousands, was born to blush unseen, where, if only one ripened berry to day invited the hunter, other kinds promised their welcome fruit in due but later season. Rarely did the dull gray of the sky dim the glory of a whole day, and the short summer showers, freshening the beauty of the landscape and abating the fervid heat of midsummer, seemed only too infrequent. And above all, the pure, free upland air that gives vigor and health to the body, joy and lightness to the heart, almost annihilates distance to the eye, and in breathing which, one drinks into the lungs the very wine of life. Surely more than the heroes of Virgil's song did they feel that sweet in their memory would abide these days forever. Of the mountains, now always in sight, and a constant source of inspiration to the eager explorers, those to the north and northwest were yet snow-capped, and Lewis says, "They glisten with great beauty when the sun shines on them in a particular direction, and most probably from the glittering appearance have derived the name of the Shining Mountains." During his explorations of the country around the falls, Captain Lewis visited a remarkable and beautiful spring near the present city of Great Falls, Montana. Of it he writes, "The fountain, which perhaps is the largest in America, is situated in a pleasant level plain, about 25 yards from the river, into which it falls over some steep, irregular rocks, with a sudden descent of about 6 feet in one part of its course. The water boils up from among the rocks with such force near the center that the surface seems higher than the earth on the sides of the fountain, which is a handsome turf of fine green grass." While the main party was making the portage, a detachment was occupied in fitting up a boat of skins, the iron frame of which, 36 feet long, had been prepared for the purpose at Harper's Ferry. The iron frame is to be covered with skins, and requires thin shaped strips of wood for lining. The skins necessary to cover it have already been prepared, 28 elk and 4 buffalo skins. This experimental boat proved to be a total failure, and it was not till Lewis's long journey was nearly over that he copied the skin boat of the Indian squaws, which had excited his surprise, and found that the methods of the locality could be followed with advantage in navigation as well as otherwise. As the 6 canoes were insufficient to carry all their men and supplies, Clark was sent ahead to find suitable wood for 2 more, there being no fit trees below the falls. With much difficulty trees were found, and 2 canoes, 3 feet wide and 25 and 33 feet long respectively, were fashioned. Near here a deserted Indian lodge or council house was seen. It was 216 feet in circumference, made of 16 cottonwood poles, 50 feet long, converging toward the center, where they were united and secured by large withes of sinewy willow. Although the swivel and some other articles had been cached at the head of the falls, their loads were yet very heavy, and all walked except those engaged in working the canoe. The windings of the river became very tortuous, and frequent rapids made their progress correspondingly slow and laborious. Game was less plentiful, and as it was necessary to save the dried and concentrated food for the crossing of the mountains, it became somewhat of a task to provide food for a party of 32, which consumed a quantity of meat daily equal to an elk and deer, 4 deer, or 1 buffalo. Fortunately, the berries were now ripening, and as they grew in great quantities, proved a not inconsiderable contribution to their food supply. Of currants there were red, purple, yellow, and black, all pleasant to the taste, the yellow being thought superior to any other known variety. The purple serviceberry and pinkish gooseberry were also favorites. Besides, they made use of the very abundant and almost omnipresent sunflower. Of it Lewis says, "The Indians of the Missouri, more especially those who do not cultivate maize, made great use of the seed of this plant for bread or in thickening their soup. They first parch and then pound it between 2 stones until it is reduced to a fine meal. Sometimes they add a portion of water and drink it thus diluted. At other times they add a sufficient proportion of marrow grease to reduce it to the consistency of common dough and eat it in that manner. This last composition we preferred to all the rest, and thought it at that time a very palatable dish. The Missouri now took in general a southerly course, and on July 18th they reached a bold clear stream, which was named Dearborn River for the then Secretary of War. They had intended to send back a small party in canoes with dispatches, but as they had not met the Snake Indians, and so were uncertain as to their friendliness, it was thought best not to weaken their already small party for hostilities. Lewis decided, however, to send Clark, with 3 men, in advance to open up communication with these Indians and, if possible, to negotiate for horses. Clark's journey was a failure, for the Indians, alarmed at the firing of a gun, fled into the mountains. The mountains now closed in on the explorers, and they camped one night at a place named the Gates of the Rocky Mountains. For 5 3/4 miles these rocks rise perpendicularly from the water's edge to the height of nearly 1,200 feet. They are composed of black granite near the base, but we suppose the upper part to be flint of a yellowish brown and cream color. Nothing can be imagined more tremendous than the frowning blackness of these rocks, which project over the river and threaten us with destruction. For the first 3 miles there is not a spot, except one of a few yards, in which a man could stand between the water and the towering perpendicular of the mountains. End of Chapter 5, Part 2. Recording by William Tomko.